selection. It's an incredible gift that as of yet, the human species is not really tapping into as a sacred experience. Because if the one we call God has anything to do with reality as we know reality now to be scientifically, then God is involved in an evolutionary universe as the dynamic impulse to develop. And not only as the impulse, but as that which is developing in all realms, all levels of being, through you and me. You and I are that part of spirit which is growing in space and time, in creation. Now this carries with it immense privileges and immense responsibilities, but here's my point. When we are doing this, when we are consciously growing, developing, evolving, we are having a direct and immediate experience of the sacred. This cultural fixation with retiring at age 65 to a comfortable, easy life doesn't really make sense from the perspective of ultimate reality from God. Because we grow by adapting to life conditions. We need stress in our lives. We're going to find this out in the reading from Genesis this morning in order to grow and develop. Whoever said that life was about retiring and getting comfortable and not doing anything? That's just craziness. That's just not being in touch with reality. So you put these two ways of experiencing God together, being in God and co-creating with God, and you're entitled to call yourself a evolutionary. And when you do this as a Christian, this defines Christian discipleship. In the first reading, we hear about Jacob. He's on the banks of the river Jabbok. He's already sent his family, all his possessions over, because on the other side is his brother Esau, who he's just ripped off, and he is very, very worried, and rightfully so. So as you heard the story, would you say this is a story about being in God, about being present, or is this a story about the evolutionary struggle to grow in God? And if you answered B, you go to the head of the class. Jacob wrestles all night long with this divine stranger, and he ends up being wounded in his hip for life. And the blessing that he receives from a stranger is a name change. No longer will he be Jacob, but Israel. And we're told what that word means: one who has striven with God and with humans and has prevailed. In other words, one who has faced the life conditions that have come into his life, wrestled with them, and not been overcome by them. Striven with God, striven with humans, faced reality, and grown as a result. It's a beautiful story. This is as apt a description of evolutionary spirituality as we're likely to find anywhere. This is hard work, this evolutionary path. It's a wrestling match. We're involved in ordeals that come into our life all the time. And as we face those ordeals, those are the very conditions that help us to grow and evolve and increase complexity, consciousness, and compassion. This is why I said what I said about this vision of retiring to the easy life. Spiritually, it doesn't make sense. There are dark nights of the soul. We confront powers both within and without that take us to higher and higher stages of awareness. And the beauty of this biblical tale is that it tells us directly when we're doing this, it's a sacred experience. The wrestling match, it turns out, was with God. Striven with God and with humans and has prevailed. It's a sacred journey. It is the evolutionary path of holy and blessed unrest. And then you get to the reading from the New Testament, which balances this dynamic of evolutionary striving with a story about Jesus being still and knowing God in the blessed rest. Jesus withdraws to a deserted place to be by himself for the entire day. Spends the whole day on his own. No disciples, no healings, no people, no crowds. He's simply taking time to be in the presence of the holy. He retreats from the striving, from the needs of the crowd, from all the buzz and the dazzle and the dizzying distractions, to rest in a much deeper identity. And he's not going to stay in that space. He never does he? He's work to do. Disciples to train, crowds to heal, the hungry to feed. And he shows us in the story that being and doing are not opposite propositions. They're not in contrast with each other. The teacher continues to tell us in class that the goal of my yoga is to find stillness, not just between the postures, but in them when I'm sweating and my muscles are quivering, to still the mind and simply to be in the midst of the postures. It is possible to do this. There are people walking around, believe it or not, who are able to achieve this kind of stillness in the midst of action, and Jesus was one of them. But for most of us, the more drama and the more emotion and the more desire that we experience, the more we contract into our small, fearful selves, and we actually begin to believe that we are that basket case. But we're not. Don't believe it. We're this expansive awareness that's growing in compassion every day as we risk wrestling with God and being in God. And this story, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, tells us what can happen when we're able to stay connected with God, both as the source of pure awareness and as that dynamic, evolutionary impulse to create a new future. Where the disciples see only insurmountable limits and dead ends, there are too many people to feed, so Jesus sends them away. Jesus sees an opportunity to manifest abundance. He has a more expansive consciousness. When the disciples experience themselves as passive victims of fate, they run like helpless victims of circumstance and ask Jesus to solve the problem. But Jesus does what? He requires them to access their own untapped potential to fashion a new future out of these life conditions that are presenting themselves to them. You give them something to eat, he says to them. Did you hear that? You give them something to eat. Make it happen. Wrest a blessing from this situation just like your ancestor Jacob. Deal with it. And so we see in the story Jesus multiplying not just food, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, the disciples' own creative capacity, their own imagination for what's possible here. When their small selves are limiting what's possible. So you see, it's good to feed the poor and the hungry. We need to do that as a church. We've been doing it for 2,000 years. We need to continue to do that. But it's even better to give them the experience of the divine power that exists within them to make the unimaginable happen. And then the next step in evolutionary discipleship is to work with the poor and hungry to figure out how they can feed each other, how we can all feed each other, and then figure out how we're going to change the system so that hunger and poverty don't exist anymore. Then we're being in God. Then we're acting as disciples of the Christ.